We're here with the Exploring St. Anthony's podcast. Today I have with me Archbishop Leland Lanois. He's also an instructor at St. Anthony. And we're going to be talking about the interesting topic, Latin. Why Latin? Why learn Latin? Why still learn Latin? The question I have for you, Dr. Lanois, is this. The argument for Latin seems to be one-sided from today's modern perspective. It's a dead language. It's hard to learn, especially for English speakers, if they haven't learned a second language. Why should they even consider thinking about learning Latin?
Well, Latin is a gateway to just about everything else in the broader subject of linguistics. Now, I could possibly say that you learn Latin because I told you to, but that isn't really what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to do is to get the idea that literally thousands of books, volumes, and other media that have been written in Latin over the centuries. It's a language in the West that was never forgotten. In other words, you don't need to put a staff of archaeologists on to deal with anything that's been found in Latin or wants to be read in Latin. And it also, the literary concepts and volumes that that we could say about it are simply in this. Latin was never forgotten in the West, and it was in actual use until about 1952.
Would that have been in the church or where?
Actually, most medical doctors wrote their prescriptions in Latin until about 1952.
Wow. So practical usage from that perspective.
Yes.
And the church, the Roman church in particular, still has Latin masses, correct?
Well, on the old Catholic side of things, many priests still celebrate Latin. In fact, when we were in England 20 years ago, I was temporarily with the old Roman Catholic Church of England, and they did all their liturgies in Latin. In fact, I did a mass on Christmas Eve 1998, and it was all in Latin.
Wow. Let's go back to something you said, though, in your response to my initial question. This wealth of published material. I mean, we're talking volumes that go back thousands of years, back to the golden age of Latin, like Cicero and Horace, the poet, and Caesar and various others. What else are we talking about when we're talking about a wealth of published volumes and works that are in Latin?
Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica was originally written in Latin.
So that would be kind of the end of the medieval age, correct?
Well, about 13th century, 1200s is when it was written, but actually maybe the beginning of the end of the medieval age.
Okay. So from a church perspective, we've got many church fathers that are in Latin, and it would be important to be able to read them in their original rather than a translation.
Yes, well, translations have one problem. Something gets lost in Latin. If you want to ask, do you speak Latin? You don't say anything like parlance or anything like that. You say loquarisne Latine, and loquarisne, for example, is the deponent verb, and that's a separate issue. But that Latine is not an adjective; it's an adverb, and it's things like that kind of get people, screwed up along the way.
Yeah. Is there a particular example that you can recall or that you can offer us where knowing Latin versus reading a translation, especially whether it's in the church fathers or in legal documents that are in Latin, that just knowing the Latin would pay off dividends?
You don't have to worry about that. All you have to do is go to a courtroom, and they're quoting Latin snippets all the time. Most of the time, most people go over them because they don't know what they mean. If they knew what they meant, they might not get as much legal trouble.
Another quick question from a linguistic perspective. Isn't it true that about 50 to 60% of the English language is actually based in Latin?
Latin or Latin through French. Now, if I were to sit down here and get on my high horse as a classic scholar, French and Spanish and Italian are all these barbaric tongues that have developed over the centuries, and they don't have the class of classical Latin. But then again, class of classical Latin isn't really all classical anymore, because it's like reading Shakespeare in the original. All the wherefores and the where tos and where arts get into the way of what Shakespeare is really trying to say, and a lot of these other constructions from classical Latin do the same thing to the ancient fathers.
So let me push back some more. I'm studying canon law. I'm studying the church fathers, especially in the Latin West. Why can't I just go to Google, take the Latin, translate from Latin into the English using Google Translator? Why is that something I should avoid?
Because it never does. It's never done a good job. Latin is one language that does not lend itself to easy manipulation by Google. It's kind of like when the computers first started translating, when they translated Russian into English. They did this back in the early 1960s, 59, 60, somewhere in there. They came up with this big computer that would translate from Russian to English and back again. And it took a phrase like the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and the vodka, and it came back, the vodka's all right, but the beef, she's no good. Go from there.
Speaking of spirits, let's kind of move forward into as we close this down. Your two courses, you offer two courses in Latin with St. Anthony. One is classical Latin. The other one is ecclesiastical Latin. What is the validity of each one? What is the target audience? What students should be taking either one?
First of all, they're almost two different languages. It's kind of like Shakespearean English to modern English. They're that much separated in time. Classical Latin deals with the language that was spoken on the streets about maybe 100 or 200 BC in ancient Rome. And of course, today they don't do that. In BC and AC are also BCE and ACE, but the Common Era language is not the same language as the classical language. And the classical language would be for people who want to deal with maybe archaeological Latin, whereas the ecclesiastical Latin is a language that's actually a little closer to Italian in its both pronunciation and usage. And it's what the church actually used up to this very day.
Okay. So those are the students. A student who wants to study the church fathers would probably be better to take or enroll in ecclesiastical Latin then.
Yes, and I'm going to try to expand that to a 2-year program eventually. Right now, we've got one course about 2/3 done, and I'll finish it as I work on this. And then the classical language goes back to, maybe from 400 or 500 years before Christ to maybe the 1st century AD, the modern era, or the AD era.
So any last words you want to tell anybody who's listening to this podcast about why they should take Latin, which is presumed to be a dead language, even though it's not, obviously. It's been used continuously for millennia. Any last words?
No, I think I've done it. The only thing I would caution you on is I said Latin is one place where Google Translator does not work, has never worked, and probably never will work.
Very good. Thank you for your time.